The Morrison Formation is a world-renowned layer of rock that dates to the Late Jurassic period. Many animals have been uncovered from these layers, including the largest and most adeptly qualified salad munchers and steak cutters to ever walk the face of the planet. One of these animals carried 3 crests atop its craggily skull, a line of armored scutes down its back, and a pair of small but handy arms. Meet your old friend, Ceratosaurus. How did we get here? Doctors Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh were some of the most ambitious and treacherously stubborn paleontologists of the 1900s. Their exploits during the period known as the Bone Wars continues to reappear on my channel and will continue to do so far into the future as I revisit the history of paleontology. A TLDR for those uninitiated in the sordid history of the Bone Wars. These two nincompoops were once friends and colleagues, helping to flesh out the then embryonic field of paleontology by swapping ideas, discussing how to analyze bones, and how it all worked together in the grand scheme of evolution. Over a period of several years, the two grew apart until a few last straws, including the infamous example of Dr. Cope placing the head of his Elasmosaurus on the tail, completely broke their friendship. It did more than that though, and the two became bitter rivals that would go so far as to sabotage each other's dig sites to get one over on the other. The two raced to find, prepare, describe, and name as many fossil organisms as possible, which resulted in a bunch of now defunct names, but also pretty much every world-famous dinosaur you could think of: Allosaurus, Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, and more. The actions of these two, and all those they hired, succeeded in broadening our understanding of past life to greater lengths than had ever been done in the previous 300 years. Between the two scientists and their underlings, over 100 species of dinosaurs and over 1,000 species of fossil organisms altogether were uncovered and named. One of their many incredible finds were the remains of the crested Ceratosaurus. During the years of 1883 and 1884, farmer Marshall Felch found the remains of a theropod dinosaur in Garden Park, Colorado, just a few miles north of my old stomping grounds of Canyon City. This area is one of the richest fossil deposits of the Morrison Formation, which stretches over many states, including Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. This find was an extraordinary one, especially for the time, for it was a nearly complete articulated skeleton encased in hard sandstone. Only a few parts of the skeleton were missing, but the majority was smooshed pretty badly due to the processes of fossilization. Like most of the finds from this area and time, it was acquired by Othniel Charles Marsh, who described the fossil and gave it the name Ceratosaurus nasicornis, which means nasal-horned horned reptile, due to the bony protrusions above the bony nasal openings. Marsh worked at the Peabody Museum of Natural History. All the Ceratosaurus material was sent there for him to describe. O.C. Marsh was missing a hefty section of the ribcage, but reconstructed the animal in such a way that it isn't too far off from what is now known of the skeleton. The biggest mistakes in his artfully inked skeletal reconstruction are of course the upright posture and dragging tail, but he also added too many back vertebrae, resulting in an overly elongated trunk. About 15 years later, in 1898 and 1899, these fossils were transferred over to the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., along with many other fossils originally in Marsh's collection. The Bone Wars forced those involved to prepare things as fast as possible, so that they could be ready for description and publication just as quickly. This meant that those holotypical Ceratosaurus fossils never got fully prepared by Marsh and his staff at the Peabody. Once the remains took their trip to the Smithsonian, they would get some proper TLC to get ready for their exhibit display. This process lasted from 1911 to 1918. Unfortunately, the trip had also done some damage to the specimen. The fossils would not get their due till 1920 with the help of another famed paleontologist of the Smithsonian, Charles Gilmore. Gilmore and his team had to figure out a way to mount the specimen so that it could be displayed. They went with mounting it in bas relief, which is a sort of fake wall technique that allowed the skeleton to stand articulated as it would have looked in life, but does not allow for it to be freestanding, which is the way many skeletal mounts are constructed in recent years. Far ahead of its time, Gilmore had reconstructed the holotype in a bird-like horizontal position, which was done due to the angling of the thigh bones and remains more or less accurate to how we see this animal and all theropods today, though it does seem like it wants to fall back on its tail. The fossils of the holotype, encased in the plaque wall, had remained restricted from study until 2014 when the museum began its renovation of the fossil halls, which reopened in 2019 with the Ceratosaurus mount a freestanding cast replica, getting a good thwacking from a Stegosaurus. The holotype remained the only specimen of this genus until the early 1960s, which seems to be the case for a lot of these early finds, no doubt due to Bone Wars shenanigans. The Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry of Cleveland, Utah, is another site of extreme diversity in Late Jurassic Morrison Formation flora and fauna. Alongside the likes of the mighty Allosaurus and the thunderous Apatosaurus, paleontologist James Madsen and his team excavated a new fragmentary specimen of Ceratosaurus. This new specimen included a skull and represented the largest Ceratosaurus yet found. This giant was disarticulated and fragmentary. Found over various dig seasons, the parts and pieces were collected from different areas of the same place and are thought to come from one individual animal. Enough of the specimen was found to suggest to Madsen and his team that they had a unique new kind of Ceratosaurus on their hands. Then, in 1976, a new specimen was uncovered from Fruita, Colorado by Thor Eriksson. Fruita is another locality where a great wealth of fossil resources is found. These remains, which were articulated as a single skeleton, were taken to the nearby Dinosaur Journey Museum of Natural History. When I say articulation, I mean many of the pieces of the skeleton were in the same place they were when the animal died. A whole piece, so to speak. The entire underside of the animal was missing, which included the lower jaw, the arms, and the belly ribs. James Madsen and his co-author Samuel Wells published a long monograph describing the Utah specimens of Ceratosaurus, which included their 1960s finds and Eriksson's 1976 find. The big 1960s specimen was named Ceratosaurus dentisulcatus, meaning furrow-toothed horned lizard, after the furrows found in its teeth, larger, more curved teeth, and nose holes placed further down in front of the snout. They then named Eriksson's specimen Ceratosaurus magnicornis, meaning large horned lizard, due to the size of the crests atop its head. Following this discovery was one made in 1992 by means of the Agate Basin Quarry of Utah. This find has remained undescribed and unnamed, but fossil material found, which include the front half of the skull, vertebrae, and pelvic bones, suggest an animal even bigger than Ceratosaurus dentisulcatus. In 1999, paleontologist Brooks Britt described yet another specimen of Ceratosaurus from Bone Cabin Quarry in Wyoming, and it was the first to represent a rather young individual. Researchers reasoned it as a juvenile animal due to the unfused sutures in the bones. This is one of the most common characteristics of immaturity, since young animals have a lot more cartilage in their skeletons than adult animals do. A few more finds of Ceratosaurus have been found in other dig sites throughout the American Southwest, but none were complete. Most are extremely fragmentary teeth and vertebrae. These bits and pieces have been recovered from Dinosaur National Monument in Utah, Como Bluff in Wyoming, and Dry Mesa and Myget Moor quarries in Colorado. Other animals found in the same deposits as Ceratosaurus usually have tens of specimens to their genus, but not so for Ceratosaurus. Not many of the horned reptile are found with much frequency. This might point towards the animal's rarity in its ecosystem, but before jumping to that conclusion, I think we should check in on the Jurassic deposits overseas, Europe and Africa specifically. Over the course of Earth's history, the continents have moved around into various positions. Everyone knows that all the continents were connected as one supercontinent called Pangaea. As the Triassic period transitioned into the Jurassic period, the continents broke up and moved once again. During the time of Ceratosaurus, though, the continent of Europe was a series of large and small islands. These islands didn't contact the fledgling continent of North America, but they were extremely close as a consequence of being connected only tens of millions of years prior. Africa, however, had fully disconnected from North America and Europe, but remained attached to South America, India, Antarctica, and Australia. In the Triassic, the connection meant populations of organisms weren't as isolated as they are today, but in the Jurassic, they started to diversify. I bring up tectonics here because the flora and fauna of Jurassic North America, Europe, and Africa had a lot of similarities. These continents contained long-necked, long-tailed diplodocids, big-armed, giraffe-like macronarians, early iguanodonts, allosaurs, megalosaurs, stegosaurs, early ankylosaurs, and more. In the early 1900s, the remains of something resembling Ceratosaurus were taken from the sediments of what is now known as Tanzania. From 1909 to 1913, the extremely industrious German paleontologist Werner Janisch and his team set off to the extraordinarily productive outcrops of the Tendaguru Formation in Tanzania. In the 3 years prior to this expedition, over 250 tons of bones from a slew of different dinosaurs had been recovered, but this newer trip to the rocks brought back some fragmentary carnivore remains. Janisch finally got to describing these theropod dinosaur remains in 1925, once he'd gotten them back to the Berlin Museum for Naturkunde. The remains he described as Ceratosaurus were parts of the skull, leg, and vertebrae from the tail. Eventually, he figured there was enough difference between his fragments and those skeletons found in North America, so he called it Ceratosaurus rochlingi. Madsen and Wells were
good man and thorough.
And among their thorough work in their monograph, they made sure to include these African pieces of these horned reptile. They found that the remains described by Janisch were not diagnostic enough to be the scaffolding to support the work crew of the Ceratosaurus rochlingi species. The bones were therefore just labeled Ceratosaurus without any more specifics. Some researchers have questioned Madsen and Wells' analyses here, instead suggesting that the Tendaguru Ceratosaurus remains aren't diagnostic enough to call them Ceratosaurus at all. Diagnostic is the term used to describe how unique an organism is from already known ones. The more diagnostic, the more unique and separate from its most recent common ancestors and cousins. For example, paleontologist Oliver Rauhat wrote in 2011 that both the weird African Ceratosaurus fossils and some other twofers found in the same area could possibly be some kind of ceratosaur, but can't be confidently given the title of Ceratosaurus. That would make whatever animal those pieces belong to a relative of Ceratosaurus itself. In Portugal, a team of paleontologists led by Octavio Matias were dusting and chiseling away fragments of fine-grained yellow sandstone that were once part of a Jurassic floodplain. The team uncovered a right femur, left tibia, and many teeth that probably belonged to Ceratosaurus. This find, made between 2000 and 2006, came from the Lorinha Formation, a fossil-rich layer of rock that contains just about the same types of animals found in the American Southwest's Morrison Formation. This material was finally described in 2015 as belonging to the already erected species Ceratosaurus dentisulcatus by Matias and friends. Some researchers have questioned this classification under the assertion that the bones aren't diagnostic enough for a species-level distinction. Instead, the researchers argue, the remains are only able to be called Ceratosaurus. Aside from those specimens that are definitely Ceratosaurus, or those that may or may not be Ceratosaurus, Some Ceratosaurus-adjacent fossils, in the form of teeth, were uncovered in Switzerland by Werner Janich, and there's some teeth from Uruguay. The characteristics of the Uruguay teeth are technically only found in Ceratosaurus, but the researchers who described them cautioned away from slapping the Ceratosaurus label on them till more remains are found to corroborate such an identity. With all these specimens of the handsome horned himbo lizard, I think it's time to compile them all together and assess what they mean for the biology of the animal. Biology of horned himbos. It's not the size that counts, it's how you use it. There are currently 3 relatively valid species of this beast: Nasicornis, Denticilcatus, and Magnicornis. They differ in some minor skeletal characteristics, but also in size. The largest specimen was estimated to be about 8.8 meters, 28 feet in length, and 980 kilograms, 2,160 pounds in weight. This estimation was made informally by Madsen and was changed to 7 meters, 23 feet long, and between 452 kilograms, 996 pounds, and 700 kilograms, 1,540 pounds when some better math was applied. Though the specimen was downsized just a tad, I don't really see it as out of the question that some Ceratosauruses got as big as 8.8 meters, or potentially a tad larger. We just haven't found them yet. The smaller specimens, on the other hand, have been estimated at 400 kilograms, 881 pounds to 670 kilograms, 1,480 pounds, and 5.3 meters, 17 feet to 6 meters, 20 feet. That's a lot of numbers I just threw at you, but they matter to some people. I just think it's neat that Ceratosaurus was this big, and yet still considered lower on the size spectrum compared to what it lived with.
Little baby man. Little baby man.
Ceratosaurus has some rather small arms. Not quite as tiny as Tyrannosaurs or Abelisaurs, but small compared to Allosaurs or the primitive Maniraptorans it lived alongside. These arms ended in 4 chunky fingies, 3 of which were tipped with long, dangerous talons. The presence of 4 fingers is something more common among theropod dinosaurs that branched off the theropod family tree pretty early. Critters like Coelophysoids, Dilophosaurs, and the Ceratosaurian-derived Abelisaurs all retained this early feature as well. The Ceratosaurus paw is wide and short, with a set of recurved talons. Obviously, they still had a use, even in their diminutive state, as they'd be a lot more obviously useless if they weren't being used. The true list of uses for Ceratosaurus's arms, and the arms of any dinosaur for that matter, is probably longer and more surprising than we can ever imagine. Ceratosaurus could have used its nose pickers to hold on to struggling prey as it killed it, to carry around already dead prey for late-night snacking, for scratching themselves and others like adorable reptilian murder kittens, to push themselves up after laying down, for making sweet, sweet love. Watch my video on dinosaur sex, and more. Since Ceratosaurus arms were relatively small, I don't see them being used frequently in offensive combat. The smaller and younger animals seem to have longer arms proportional to their bodies than the older and larger animals, which seems to be a common characteristic amongst most theropod dinosaurs, which may mean the younger animals were using their arms more, while their jaw strength matured to that of an adult. Suit of Amor. The holotype material of our handsome horned himbo preserved some small rounded triangular pieces of bone situated above the narrow spines of the vertebrae in the neck and base of the tail. These pieces of bone are identified as osteoderms. Osteoderms are simply little pieces of bone that are planted underneath the skin of an animal. Some critters have a keratin sheath covering the place where the bone is, and some don't. They're often used as defensive chainmail-like armor and may have been co-opted for display in some of the non-avian dinosaurs. The presence of these triangular armor bits on the neck near the base of the skull and at the base of the tail suggests they probably formed a ridge of scutes from the base of the skull to the end of the tail. These osteoderms have also been found in other specimens of Ceratosaurus, suggesting most of them had this kind of ridge you usually see in pop culture's depictions of dinosaurs. Osteoderms have also been found associated with other parts of their body, as in the holotype of the Ceratosaurus nasicornis species. But what about feathers? It's not impossible that these animals had feathers, whether of cassowary type or quill type, but considering the presence of the crocodilian-like pieces of armor embedded in the skin, it is more likely these animals and their relatives were devoid of feathers. This makes sense since the Ceratosaurs gave rise to the abelisaurs, which are considered one of the few lineages almost entirely covered in scales, scutes, and armors. Peacocking is bad and you shouldn't do it. The biggest, most obvious characteristic of the animal is the crests. Ceratosaurus had a pointed and rounded piece of bone above the nasal openings on the skull. This crest has rugose patterning, which suggests it was covered in a keratinous sheath when the animal was alive. Ceratosaurus had two more erupting from the front of each eye, which were much like the nose horn and also similar to the allosaurs it lived with. The animal probably used these crests for display, as keratin can be rather colorful, and they are bigger and more elaborate on adult individuals and small and underdeveloped in juveniles. That usually means this kind of structure was more important to sexually mature animals. Crests of Ceratosaurus are much too thin and fragile to be used as physical defense, and even in shoving matches these pieces of bone would break too easily, which points even more to the use as display only. What big teeth you have? If you've heard about Ceratosaurus before, I'll bet one of the things you've heard about it is how big its toothers are. This is true, but not for the reason you might think. They weren't naturally ultra-long saw blade teeth. When an animal, especially one with long pointy teeth like some theropod dinosaurs, dies, the ooshy-scooshy stuff that kept the teeth attached to the jawbones decays and falls apart. Once that happens, the teeth begin to slip and/or slide out of the mouth. If the teeth stop at a certain point before tumbling out, and the bones are then completely buried in the first step of fossilization, then the teeth are preserved in such a way to make them look longer than they would have been when the animal was alive. This phenomenon is called tooth slippage, and is a major problem with toothy dinos. Ever hear that Tyrannosaurus teeth are as big as bananas? Well, they are if you count the entire tooth rather than the bit that stuck out of the jaw. Most dinosaur teeth only stuck out enough to be used as a single tooth in the saw blade that was the critter's jaws. Ceratosaurus didn't have super long teeth, but they were still a tad longer than what you see in other theropods. This is a defining trait of Ceratosaurus too, so it's helpful if trying to identify a close relative. Cranial kinesis? I barely know her. Dr. Robert Bob Bakker was one of the guys responsible for the dinosaur renaissance of the 1980s and 90s. This period encapsulates the reimagining of the dinosaurs' paleobiology based on evidence of high metabolisms and biomechanics along the lines of mammals and birds. It saw our favorite theropod friends go from fat, toddling, tail-dragging killers to intelligent, fast-moving predators like we see today. Dr. Bakker discussed the skull bones of Ceratosaurus in his book, The Dinosaur Heresies, which was the tome that nailed down most of the evidence for the ideas which came out of the dinosaur renaissance. Bakker argued that the skull bones of Ceratosaurus were only loosely held together. This would mean that the animal had some degree of movement among these skull bones. This condition is seen most perfectly in snakes, but is also found in lizards, parrots, fish, and some early amphibians. Bakker also posited this level of movement for the lower jaw. He suggested that the bones of the jaw could move against each other, and that the quadrate bone of the skull was capable of swinging outwards. Together, this would mean the skull could shift and widen at the jaw joint, giving the animal the ability to swallow meals much larger than it would if it couldn't do this. This is called cranial kinesis. Unfortunately for this pretty neat idea, studies in the years after this book have all but proven this as an impossibility for most known theropod dinosaurs. Casey Holliday and Larry Whitmer of Whitmer Lab reevaluated these claims in other theropod dinosaurs, like Tyrannosaurus and Allosaurus, using computed tomography scans and computer-generated imaging models that utilize a lot of physics and biomechanical calculations. They concluded that muscle-powered cranial kinesis couldn't be proven for any dinosaur species they looked at, which included groups that Ceratosaurus belonged to. This means that cranial kinesis for theropod dinosaurs is pretty unlikely. Tall tails. If we take a look at the front part of the tail of Ceratosaurus, you'll notice that the neural arches of the vertebrae are tall and do not bend backwards as far as other theropods. This means that the tail would have a very tall profile in side view and was also quite wide. A tall, wide tail allowed for big caudofemoralis muscles which attached the thigh to the tail, helping the animal move the leg in intense ways for running. All this suggests an animal that used its tail a lot. Paleontologist Robert Bakker and Gray Burr hypothesized in 2004 that Ceratosaurus hunted primarily aquatic prey due to the combination of thick, crocodile-like tail and long, recurved teeth. The scientists found that throughout over 50 localities of the Morrison Formation, the teeth of Ceratosaurus, as well as Torvosaurs, were most commonly found near water sources. This suggests an animal that was more at home hunting for lungfish and crocodiles in the rivers, lakes, and streams of late Jurassic floodplains than long-distance hunting of agile prey. The study suggests Ceratosaurus was the more aquatic predator, while Torvosaurus was more of the terrestrial predator that would come to the rivers to hunt when the large herbivores had migrated due to the summer dry seasons. Like with all things in science, this paper got a rebuttal paper that showed how the reasons for thinking the thing they thought was actually incorrect and that they should think this way because of reason X, Y, and Z, but like in a good way. Paleontologist Xiangyu Yun published a paper on the idea of a semi-aquatic Ceratosaurus in 2019. One of the biggest problems with labeling something semi-aquatic in scientific literature is that no one has ever gotten together and collectively agreed upon what semi-aquatic actually means. Like with any good debate, you have to define your terms first, but everyone has been using their own definition of semi-aquatic, assuming the definition is intuitive. For example, water deers are a species of tusked cervid native to China and Korea. They spend a lot of time in marshes, swamps, and rivers of the region when foraging for yummy gummy soft water plants. However, when not feeding, they prefer to be on dry land. Are they semi-aquatic for doing that? They don't have any adaptations specifically for being in the water, at least no more than any other land animal. The vast majority of land animals retain the ability to swim or move through water. It's kind of an intuitive survival instinct we all need. So right off the bat, the use of semi-aquatic for Ceratosaurus is dubious, unless thoroughly defined. In the 2004 paper by Bakker and Burr, they describe the adaptations of Ceratosaurus as similar to modern crocodilians, so it's safe to assume their definition of semi-aquatic is the type of semi-aquatic adaptation seen in crocodilians. Okay, I guess that narrows it down a bit. Xiangyu Yun laid out all of the arguments made by Bakker and Burr as to why they described Ceratosaurus as semi-aquatic. These include a resemblance between the tail of Ceratosaurus and crocs by way of tall neural spines at the base of the tail, their very deep chevron bones on the underside of the tail, and a tail far more flexible than those of Allosaurus or Torvosaurus. For the first argument, it turns out that crocodilians have tall neural spines throughout most of the tail's length. Ceratosaurus, on the other hand, only has tall neural spines at the base of the tail. Strike one. The type of tall neural spines near the base of the tail is seen in theropod dinosaurs traditionally known as fully terrestrial, like Abelisaurus, Giganotosaurus, Gallimimus, and Struthiomimus, among others. Strike two. The neural spines found in crocs are subcircular in cross-section. They're big ol' bony cylinders. Ceratosaurus, on the other hand, has a blade-shaped neural spine with a flat cross-section, which is seen in most other theropod dinosaur neural spines. Strike three! Is it out? Not yet. The depth of the chevron bones is not a great tell as to whether or not an animal was semi-aquatic, no matter how you want to define that word. Deep chevron bones are found in basically all theropod dinosaurs, especially the big meaty ones that walked on land for surezies, let me give you some examples. Herrerasaurus, Caudipteryx, Heyuania, and Conchoraptor also have deep as hell chevrons, and yet they are definitely mostly terrestrial. Curious. Strike 4. The flexibility of the Ceratosaurus tail is not a great indicator of a semi-aquatic lifestyle. This is because virtually all terrestrial theropod dinosaurs have a flexible as hell tail too. Sure, semi-aquatic beasts have a super flexy tube tail as well, but it's just not something you can use to tell you something is definitely semi-aquatic. Terrestrial animals need that flexy tube tail in order to swim if the need arises, but not for living most of their lives in water. Strike 5. On top of all of this, you usually see a lot more adaptations for something that has returned to the water to live most or some of its life there. Crocodilians are highly specialized for this kind of lifestyle, and they were the ones Bakker and Burr decided to use as a comparison. Big oof. Crocodilians are probably one of the worst things to compare with dinosaurs, despite their relations. Sure, crocodilians are the closest living cousins to the non-avian dinosaurs, but they diverged from that family tree a long time ago in order to be big flat f***s and slosh around in the swamps. There's not a single dinosaur, alive or dead, that convergently evolved similar adaptations to the crocodilians. That's including Spinosaurus, you nitpickers. To be fair, birds are a bad comparison too, but less so than crocs, cause like, damn. Semi-aquatic Ceratosaurus is pretty much dead in the water. Food chain me up, daddy. The American specimens of Ceratosaurus come exclusively from the Morrison Formation. This huge layer of rock, containing many smaller distinct layers of rock, dates to between 156 and 146 million years ago. This span of time includes the Oxfordian, Kimmeridgian, and Tithonian stages of the Late Jurassic period. At these times, the environment consisted of swampy lowlands lush with aquatic plants and animals. River channels and floodplains were also distributed across the ecosystem. The rock strata show evidence that these places were semi-arid environments that saw a distinct change in seasons, from wet monsoons to dry periods. Ceratosaurus were similar to the hyenas of today in one particular way. That is, they were one of the largest of the smaller predators, more than capable of taking down anything smaller than themselves, as well as potentially dangerous prey like smaller allosaurs, stegosaurs, and maybe even young sauropods. Alongside Ceratosaurus lived the much smaller theropods Stochisasaurus, Silurus, Coperion, Hesperornithoides, Marchasaurus, Tanicolagrius, and Ornitholestes, which offered little competition of threat to Ceratosaurus. The often much larger Allosaurus and Torvosaurus would have been the animals Ceratosaurus had to look out for. Allosaurus and Torvosaurus acted as the lions of the ecosystem, being larger and more capable of taking down the more dangerous animals of the time, which included Stegosaurus, Hesperosaurus, Maimuropelta, Gargoylosaurus, Haplocanthosaurus, Maripunisaurus, Suacia, Gelampus, Caetidacus, Smetanosaurus, Barosaurus, Dislocosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Supersaurus, Camarasaurus, and Brontosaurus. Smaller ornithischians lived as quick-footed herbivores that were probably the more common targets of the medium-sized theropods. And these animals included Camptosaurus, Frutodons, Eutiodon, Nanosaurus, Dryosaurus, Drinker, Othnialosaurus, and Othnielia. Along with these dinosaurs lived many other creatures, including amphibians, insects, spiders, lungfish, champsosaurs, lizards, crocodiles, mammals, turtles, snakes, and pterosaurs. I love listing off things. The fauna found in the Tendaguru beds, where the African Ceratosaurus was found, contains a bunch of similar dinosaurs. The Tendaguru formation is just like the Morrison in being a dummy layer of rock, containing a bunch of smaller, distinct layers, and it ranges from about Middle Jurassic to early Cretaceous in age, about 174 to 145 million years ago. The rocks deposited in the Mandava Basin preserve a semi-arid climate that retained more moisture than areas further inland, due to the coast bringing in hot, wet air. Like what's observed in the Morrison Formation, the Tendaguru records a repeated shift from shallow marine to tidal flat habitats. Once the sea retreated, animals would live in the semi-arid tidal flat areas and leave behind their remains. How gracious of them. Among the largest of the Tendaguru beasts was Giraffatitan, a Brachiosaurus lookalike known from far more complete material. Instead of the huge billboard-backed Stegosaurus, this environment was home to the infernally spiky Kentrosaurus, which was about half as big. Instead of Dryosaurus or Othnielia, there was Disolatosaurus, a swift bipedal herbivore with small arms and beak. There wasn't Apatosaurus or Brontosaurus here. Instead, there were the short-necked Dicraeosaurs, like Dicraeosaurus itself. This millions-year-old layer also contained early titanosaurs, like the Samphospondyle Australopithecus, or the Macronarian Yanentia. Pteriosaurs, bizarre brachiosaur chimerosaur lookalikes, were common in Africa in the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, and are represented here by Tendaguria. The Memenchisaurids, those noodle-necked saurischians known for necks longer than their bodies and tails combined, were here too, in the form of Wamworkadia. Remains of allosaurs, Carcharodontosaurids, and Torvosaurs have been found in this formation. However, due to their fragmentary nature and the date of their description, they probably represent close relatives of the true Torvosaurus and Allosaurus of North America and Europe. Most of the North American dinosaur groups of the Late Jurassic were mirrored in Africa, but tweaked by their unique biogeography. Ceratosaurus is the odd one out in this regard. Elaphrosaurus is an almost chimeric creature that remained unidentifiable without close relatives to point to. Its most recent identification places it as a member of the Noasauridae group, which were small to medium-sized little-armed, long-necked critters that came in two flavors: flytrap-mouthed finger nippers, or fast-growing toothless-beaked speedsters. The tooth of the early Spinosaur, Ostafricosaurus, means the African Ceratosaurus was brushing tails with the predecessors to the true rulers of the waterways. Aside from the dinosaurs, Ceratosaurus came face to face with crocs like Bernissartia, amphibians, fish of all sorts, mollusks, and a bunch of mammals. This was only the second place Ceratosaurus remains have been found though. Another entire geochron waits for us in Portugal. Third verse, same as the first. The Lourinhã Formation of Portugal is another giant cake slice of rock with little layers of smaller cakes and icings held inside. This formation is more similar to the Morrison Formation than either are to the Tendaguru Formation. Like the others though, it too shows shifts from marine and near-marine sediments to tidal flat dry periods. Confirmed remains of Allosaurus, Ceratosaurus, and Torvosaurus come from these deposits. Torvosaurus and Allosaurus remains are distinct enough to justify new Portuguese species, distinct from the American ones. Aside from the big three, there was the unplaceable Lourinhanosaurus, which could be an Allosauroid, a Sinraptorid, or a Megalosauroid. There was the itty-bitty early Carcharodontosaurid Lusovenator. A large diplodocid lived here in the form of Dinerasaurus, which may be a member of the Supersaurus genus. The chimerosaurid Lourinhãsaurus, Brachiosaur Lusotitan, early Titanosaur Oceanotitan, and Pteriosaur Zibi stomped around the place, making our beloved Ceratosaurus uncomfortable. Someone please think of the Ceratosaurus. The other side of the dinosaur tree, the Ornithischians, were present here too, like Stegosaurus decentris, Raregaia, and some possible Stegosaurus fossils. Dracopelta was the resident early small boy ankylosaur. Meanwhile, there were the ornithopods Draconyx, Dryosaurus, Eostryosaurus, and Philodon. Of course, like any good late Jurassic ecosystem, the Lourinhã Formation contains a good diversity of mammals, fish, invertebrates, and pterosaurs. Can't we all just get along? As I have previously touched on, all bone beds where Ceratosaurus material is found, the remains of other predators, usually of a greater size, are found as well, and in higher frequency. This is even the case in equivalent bone beds of other continents. Ceratosaurus is there, right alongside the other two massive brutes, Allosaurus and Torvosaurus. In 1998, Donald Henderson analyzed the remains of these predators, and each locality they are found in to help elucidate any details that may help figure out how they could all live together without competing with one another for resources. Many theropods that are spread out across entire continents have shown different morphs that suggest different adaptations to different environments, which is just going to happen when you stretch an entire genus or species across such a large region. This can be seen in the gracile and robust morphs of Tyrannosaurus and many other large predators with rich fossil records. This can also be said for Ceratosaurus's contemporary, Allosaurus. Henderson tried to find out how all these animals could avoid directly competing with one another. Because if you have two or more species of animals occupying the same niche or place in the food chain, then they will directly compete with one another over the same food source, eventually forcing one or the other to adapt, die, or leave. The more in common these two or more species have in appearance, behavior, or anatomy, the more likely they are to compete with one another for resources. Henderson compared Ceratosaurus and two morphs of Allosaurus, a short-muzzled morph and a long-muzzled morph, and found that the long-muzzled morph competed more with Ceratosaurus than did the short-muzzled morph, which means that the long-muzzled Allosaurus morph and the Ceratosaurus shared a similar ecological niche and may have hunted similar prey. In localities where the long-muzzled Allosaurus is common, the Ceratosaurus is uncommon, and vice versa. The long snouts of Ceratosaurus and the long-muzzled Allosaur are built more for tearing into prey and delivering quick, slashing bites that whittle away the prey's stamina, while the short snout of the short-muzzled Allosaur is built for a strong, powerful bite akin to cats. This differentiates between predators and allows them to live together without directly competing with one another. But that is to say nothing of what they do to each other if they came face to face. But what exactly is Ceratosaurus? What are you doing, step bro? When this animal was discovered, no one really knew what it was. Since it was found during a time in which paleontology was a relatively new field, and only a handful of theropods were known from what you could call complete remains, Othniel Charles Marsh had to scour the Ceratosaurus bones for characteristics that would tell him what it was and who it was related to. He saw characteristics in the pelvis and metatarsals that were found only in birds, giving another early example of the paleontological link between birds and their non-avian ancestors. Since this animal was quite different from Allosaurus, Megalosaurus, and the growing collection of Coelurosaurs incorrectly termed Carnosaurs, Marsh created a separate infraorder which he named Ceratosauria. This held only Ceratosaurus for many decades, with the only change being the further specification of the family Ceratosauridae, which again held only Ceratosaurus. This made the Ceratosauridae fall out of use, until the discovery of animals that were undoubtedly more closely related. During the early 1900s, lithe Triassic carnivores like Coelophysis were found to contain some skeletal similarities to Ceratosaurus. Then the discoveries of abelisaurs in the 1980s and 90s showed that the short-skulled baby-armed theropods were descended from animals like Ceratosaurus. Geniodectes, a very fragmentary genus from South America, is considered another member in the Ceratosauridae due to the overly large teeth it had in its mouth, similar in shape to those of Ceratosaurus. Vostrovenator is another genus ascribed to this group, but being so fragmentary it is still on shaky ground. Only new taxa will help to better outline the evolutionary history of this startling animal. Lamestream Media. Being one of the first complete theropod remains from North America, in a time in which dinosaur fossils of good quality were becoming more well known, but still languished in the dark, Ceratosaurus fast became a well-known animal. Its striking head crest and raptorial presence lent this animal to being a star in art very well, It has been reproduced in 2 dimensions hundreds of times since its discovery, with well-known artists Charles R. Knight, J.M. Gleason, and John Sibbick being among the many that have done so. Ceratosaurus has also appeared on the silver screen many times. Ray Harryhausen used the animal's 1950s likeness in the movie 1 Million Years BC. It is shown fighting a Triceratops, but we're not even gonna get into that logistical nightmare. The animal appears in Disney's Fantasia in the short titled Rite of Spring. However, it is highly stylized. Ceratosaurus also briefly appears in Jurassic Park 3, in which the main characters are spooked by its appearance, at which point the Ceratosaurus becomes spooked by the smell of another dinosaur's droppings. Ceratosaurus has appeared in way too many other things since these things that I'm just not gonna talk about it. I'm gonna save it for another video though. This genus is a fascinating one, the bulldog-like hyena of the Jurassic. It appears to be the most crocodilian of nearly all Dinosauria, with an assortment of scutes and protective bony adornments, as well as a confident smile only an alligator could love. This predator has captured the imagination in such a way that we would never forget it, and only more finds of this rare creature will continue to open our minds to the horned reptile. Let me know what you think about Ceratosaurus in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Make sure you leave a like and comment on this video, share it around, and subscribe. While you're at it, ring the notification bell too if you want to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching. Want to help Edge out? Subscribe to the Patreon at any tier you like for a whole smorgasbord of delicious offerings. Many thanks to Thea Svensson, Steve Bradshaw, Staniforth Hopkins, Nattycat, Dinosaur, Arda Bayer, Abby Smith, Henry Brennan, Dana Manchester, Chris Frampton, and Antron. You've all helped to make this channel possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you.